Good afternoon. Welcome to Lunch with Books. My name is Sean. I'll be your host. Today we're exploring a topic that a lot of people are interested in, which includes organized crime here in Wheeling. Before we get to our guests today, I will tell you that next week, Ron Coddington, who's been here before at Lunch with Books, has a new book called Civil War Nurses, which explores, as the title suggests, nurses of the Civil War, along with women who worked to care for the wounded who weren't nurses. He collects photographs, and the book is primarily a photographic book. And on the 3rd of November, which is Election Day, so you will need a break from the stress of that day, we will have for you poetry from Aaron Murphy at Penn State Altoona in the Wheeling Poetry Series hosted by Mark Harshman. So hope you can join us then. And on the 3rd, our live stream of the Upper Ohio Valley Festival of Books will celebrate memoir writing. Today, we are here with two journalists from the Canton Repository, Shane Hoover has been a journalist for 20 years, most of them at the repository. He grew up in Alliance, Ohio, and is a graduate of Kent State University. And Tim Botos has been a reporter for the repository for the last 21 years. He's covered a variety of beats and has won numerous awards for his writing. So here are Tim and Shane.
Hi, I'm going to start here, and then I'm going to kick it over to Shane in a little bit, and we'll kind of go back and forth and take you through this. I did not include in my bio that I went to the University of Akron, but I think since Shane said Kent State, I need to say Akron. We're kind of rivals. But we're here to discuss The Madam Must Die. It was a 5-part series that we did last year for our paper here in Ohio, the Canton Repository. Actually, it was the first of 2 multi-part projects that Shane and I did last year. Both of them tied back to a former coroner here in Stark County. His name was Gus Shaheen. He was the coroner here for about 2 decades during most of the 1960s and all of the 1970s. So here in Canton, where we're at, I'll tell you a little bit about it. We're about 100 miles, probably northwest of you guys in Wheeling. Most people know of Canton for the Pro Football Hall of Fame. It's kind of their claim to fame. Aside from the Pro Football Hall of Fame, Canton was a kind of an old steel industry town, blue collar. A lot of the jobs left. The population has dwindled some over the years because of that. The county as a whole, although we're the county seat, we're kind of surrounded by some farming communities, some little towns, a couple other cities, Alliance for one, Massillon for another, kind of make up Stark County. So The Madam Must Die came about, probably about 12 years ago. I was over in Massillon, talking to a detective over there for another story that I was working on at the time, and he was opening up some mail. I'm sitting across from him at his desk. He opens it up. He reads this letter, starts to read it. He kind of throws it aside. He's like, "Oh, that's another Shaheen special." So, of course, I wonder what's a Shaheen special? What does that mean? And he tells me that a lot of the old-time cops had told him about the former coroner, Gus Shaheen, and how Gus Shaheen used to come to crime scenes to rule on deaths and whatnot, drunk. Sometimes he'd bring his friends with him. Not only that, he ultimately made a lot of what the police thought were strange rulings, rulings that baffled them. Like, how could he have possibly called that a suicide when it was clearly a murder, for example? So I got intrigued and thought, well, if I could just look at all of Gus Shaheen's cases for the 20 years he was in office, there's got to be a good story in there somewhere. So kicked it around, working for a newspaper. They usually don't give you the time to do that kind of stuff, and was kind of backburnered for many years until a couple of years ago, one of the editors here Shane and I convinced them that if they give us the time to do it, it would be worthwhile. The payoff would be big in the end. So we spent, probably more than a year working on these two multi-part series. Along the way of starting to review those cases, we pretty quickly decided that the murder of Carla DeLerba, May 28th, 1974, and I called it a murder, but I should call it the death of Carla DeLerba, May 28th, 1974, probably should stand alone as a series unto itself because of the circumstances surrounding it. So that's how we came up with The Madam Must Die. Carla DeLerba, she was found dead in her bathroom in an apartment she had here in Canton. Again, this is May 29th, 1974. They found her body. She's dead in the bathroom. She's got a knife stuck in her chest. There's a towel wrapped around it. One crime scene photo showed a towel stuffed in her mouth. And so our coroner takes the body to a funeral home where he examines it and notices 3 stab wounds, including the knife still in her chest, and he ruled it, of course, a suicide. So that ruling stood until 1990, when the authorities here in our area finally exhumed Carla DeLerba. And the new coroner, he ruled it a homicide. At the time, our paper wrote very little about it. It's another reason that we decided that we needed to really find out what happened to Carla, why she died, and why it was ruled a suicide. We thought that looking into this would also give us some clues about Gus Shaheen's thought patterns and how he ruled on some of the other cases we were going to be looking at. So as we're researching the Carla DeLerba case, The Madam Must Die, we find out pretty early on that there's a guy named Paul No Legs Hankish that was going to be a pretty central figure in our series, mostly because he was the one who ordered that Carla DeLerba be murdered. Probably sounds strange to you guys in Wheeling, but neither Shane or I had ever heard of Paul Hankish until we started working on this story. I know he's practically a legend, I think, for good or bad in your area there in Wheeling. But as we're researching him and talking to people who knew him, we quickly find out that about the car bombing that blew his legs off, the fact that he had connections to the 5 crime families in New York, and basically that he ran the mob scene in Wheeling after Bill Lias was out of the picture. So along the way, we made several trips to Wheeling, Shane and I, and a photographer. We met up with Tom Burgoyne. He's a former FBI agent who worked on the case that ultimately got Hankish convicted back in 1990. And he was kind of our tour guide, showed us around, showed us an area by the river that where whorehouses used to be, including one that Carla DeLerba ran one there. Showed us all over the town, showed us a great place for a fish sandwich, of which I just can't recall the name, but I do remember it was very good. We also talked to Bill Calabash. He's a private attorney in town now, but he was a former U.S. attorney who handled the Hankish prosecution. We sat down with a guy named George Sideropoulos. He wrote a book, I believe, called Murder Never Dies, with a lot of info about Hankish in it. We just went through tons of newspaper clippings, court records, and on and on and on. And we did spend some time there at your library, the Ohio County Library. A woman named Laura Carroll. She dug up, she just had tons of stuff on Paul Hankish for us to look at. And I remember we sat in that room for hours looking through that stuff. I can tell you that although no one was ever charged with Carla DeLerba's murder, there was evidence presented at Hankish's trial there in Wheeling in 1990 He had like 218 charges against him, everything from money laundering to murder. But the Carla DeLerba case was not one of them. But during his trial, one of his strongmen, his muscle guys, Ronnie Asher, who was already in prison for another murder at the time, he testified. And he had told Tom Burgoyne this before he even got on the stand, that he told Tom Burgoyne, and then he repeated this on the witness stand, about how he went to Canton, Ohio back in 1974 with another guy named Ronnie Bryce, and how they killed a woman that they, on Hankish's order, that, and they called it painting a house. They went to paint a house, was kind of their secret code, I guess. But so we read the transcript, and it kind of went down like this. The assistant U.S. attorney's talking to Asher in court, questioning him, and he says, Mr. Asher, aside from the crime for which you're serving time at the present, have you ever killed anyone? And Asher says, in 1974. And the prosecutor says, well, where and when did that take place? And he says, well, it was in Canton, Ohio. And the prosecutor says, well, how did you do it, sir? And Asher says, I broke her neck. And Reed says, well, what else did you do? And Asher says, well, at Ronnie Bryce's insistence, because he wasn't sure she was dead or not, stabbed her. And so we'll explain a little more about how that all went down and how they ended up here in Canton and killing Carla. But first, Shane's going to tell you a little more about who Carla DeLerba was and why she had to be killed.
Right. Thanks, Tim. And so, as Tim was explaining, our investigation of these old cases in Stark County really focused on Carla's case at first. And to understand her death, we really had to understand who she was and why someone would want her dead. And so that's kind of what we spent a lot of time trying to figure out. Now, a lot of people in her life, throughout most of her life, didn't know her as Carla. She was known as Bobby. That's how her neighbors in Canton knew Carla. That's how the people she knew in Wheeling knew her. Sometimes it was Bobby. Sometimes it was Pittsburgh Bobby or black-haired Bobby. But that was the nickname that she was commonly known by. But she was born Carla Ferrari. And she was born in 1928 in a small Italian mountain town called Pinzolo. This is way in the northern part of the country. It's actually closer to Austria and Switzerland than it is to Rome. And a really picturesque place up in the Dolomite Alps. But anyways, Carla doesn't spend a lot of time there. In fact, her mother brings her to New York when she's still a baby. And while we don't know a whole lot of Carla's early years of her childhood, we know that by the time she was 11, she was living in Pittsburgh. And Carla grows up pretty fast. By the time she's 18, she's working as a shill in a gambling joint called the Chelsea Club in Pittsburgh. And this job is significant for a couple of reasons. One, it's the first documented incident where Carla is involved with organized crime, because the Chelsea Club is owned by a guy, or run by a guy named Frank the Sphinx Valenti. And he's a gangster in Pittsburgh, and he's the one who's running this club. This is who she's working for. Now, around the time she begins working there at the club, she starts a relationship with Valenti. She becomes his mistress for a while. And around the same time, she also becomes the alleged mistress of a guy named Tony Del Santer, who is a mobster from Warren, Ohio. And while these relationships, they don't really last that long, Carla goes her separate ways. These two guys go their separate ways. When a few years later, in 1951, Carla's about 22 years old at this time, a grand jury in Pittsburgh begins to investigate Valenti and Del Santer for the murder of two men. It was a gangland killing. These two guys are found in a car riddled with bullets. And the authorities think that it's Del Santer and Valenti behind the killing. Well, guess who do you think the star witness of the case is? Well, it's none other than Carla Ferrari. And the papers have a field day with this. You know, there are dozens and dozens, I think around maybe 40 some witnesses who are called. to this grand jury. But Carla is the feature attraction. And the papers describe her as the sultry Carla Ferrari. She's the mystery woman. She's the star witness of the case. Her pictures in the paper. Some of them even go a little bit further. They call her the girl with the turquoise eyes, or the girl with the violet eyes. And so they make a big deal out of Carla in this case. It's a very sensational case. It's a very high-profile case, and she's the mistress who maybe holds the key to what happened to these two men who were murdered. Well, despite all of the attention, despite the dozens of witnesses that are called to this grand jury, the case goes nowhere. It fizzles, and Del Santer and Valenti are never charged with the murder of these two guys, and Carla drifts into a life of anonymity. The following year, she marries a guy in Pittsburgh named John Antonucci. And by this time, Carla's, again, about 22 years old or so. She already has a son who was born in 1947, and she already has a criminal record. She was picked up in 1948 in my hometown of Alliance, Ohio, old railroad town, for prostitution. And she was working under the name of Martha McLean. And that's one of the things that we began to realize. When it came to tracing Carla DeLerba's life, you had to know all the names that she lived under. Because, as I said at the beginning, she was Pittsburgh Bobby or black-haired Bobby, but she was also Martha McLean. She was Roberta Lee. She was Carla Antonucci. And then ultimately, she was Carla DeLerba. And that happens in 1959. She gets divorced from Antonucci, and about 3 months later, she marries a guy named Pete DeLerba. Now, this is an important point in her life because she's been living in that Pittsburgh area, but Pete is from Canton. And so Carla and Pete, they relocate, and she lives there in Canton. Now, you wouldn't exactly describe their marriage as traditional for that time period, or probably for any other, because Pete and Carla are both involved in the prostitution game. And Pete also runs a bar. They're married in name only. They don't even really live together that often. Pete has, his girlfriends. He spends time there. Carla has her Johns. She has her boyfriends. She's not even in Canton for a lot of the time. So they basically live separate lives. But for about 6 years, from the late 1960s and into the 1970s, they live, or they keep an apartment, and Carla lives there primarily, across the street from a woman named Elva Keith. And Elva Keith has a daughter named Robin at that time. And at first, Elva and Robin, they live across the street from the DeLerbas, and then later on, they live up above in an apartment building, up and down from the DeLerbas. And they get to know Carla, who, of course, like everybody else, knows as Bobby. And they know her as the nice Italian lady who cooks really good food, and they can smell the spaghetti and the marinated meat and the chicken, cooking in her apartment, especially when they live in the apartment upstairs. And Carla invites them over. A lot of times she's made dinner. Pete's not around. She wants the company. So Elva and Robin spend a lot of time getting to know Bobby. They also do work for her. Bobby's gone a lot of the time, three weeks out of the month. She's traveling, and Elva assumes, well, she must be a businesswoman of some sort. So, she takes care of Carla's dogs. She does her laundry, cleans the apartment, gets her groceries, gives her rides. It's only later that Elva really begins to realize what exactly her neighbor is involved in, because one day Elva's cleaning the apartment and the phone rings. So she picks it up to take a message, and it's a guy propositioning her. And she's kind of stunned and shocked, and she's like, well, I don't do that. Well, she tells Bobby, and Bobby tells her, well, yeah, I'm a prostitute, and actually I run this brothel down in Wheeling when I'm not here in Canton. And in fact, it's not long after that Carla or Bobby, goes over to Elva's apartment one day and offers her $50 if she can rent Elva's bedroom, because she's got a customer. And Elva's like, no, you can't do that. I wouldn't even rent it to you for $500. But despite that incident, they remain friends, and throughout that time period, and they really, as the years go by, become friends. Elva and Robin and Carla. So when Carla's not in Canton at her apartment, those 3 weeks out of a month, what's she doing? Well, she's down in Wheeling, and it's in Wheeling where she runs a brothel on Water Street for a woman named Agnes Toomer, or Aggie Toomer. And Agnes is the foremost madam at this time along the Ohio Valley. Now, Carla has a house, and it's not there anymore, but it was this old house, and she'd have up to 15 women at a time living in the house and working in shifts. And she brings them in from all over the place. She brings them in from Ohio. She brings them in from Florida, from other parts of the country. Now, in 1973, things take a turn for Carla. She's been in and out of trouble with the police for years, throughout her whole career, going back to the late 40s, actually, 1948. But in 1973, Wheeling police raid the brothel on Water Street. And this is a bad thing for Carla, because if you remember, she's been bringing in the prostitutes from all over the place. And by bringing them across state lines, she's caught the attention of the federal authorities. It's not hard to bring someone across state lines there in Wheeling. All you got to do is bring them across the river. But that puts her on the federal prosecutor's radar. And grand juries in Miami and Cleveland both begin to investigate, and they ultimately indict Carla. Now, this is a big problem for her because, if you recall, she's not an American citizen. She was born in Italy. And so she begins to fear the possibility that she will be deported if she's convicted. And at the same time, she has a brother-in-law who's chirping in her ear, telling her, you need to cooperate. You need to, work with the prosecutors. You don't want to get deported from the country. So she's got this going on in her life, but she's telling Aggie Toomer, don't worry. I'm not going to say anything to anyone. And she calls Aggie Biggie. And she's like, Biggie, I'd never say anything to hurt you or anything damaging. So she's making those assurances to her mentor and to her accomplice in this prostitution ring. But as the case moves forward against Carla, she confides in Elva Keith that she's ready to leave the life behind. And by the life, she means the life of prostitution, and that she's going to turn state's witness against her co-conspirators in this prostitution case. But there are people in Wheeling who take it upon themselves to make sure that Carla doesn't say a word to anyone. And Tim can tell you about that.
Okay, yeah. So that's where she's at with what's going on in Wheeling. Here in Canton, like Shane said, she's telling Elva Keith, she's going to get out of the life. She might even testify. So back in Wheeling, Aggie Toomer's daughter, Joyce Sims, she says, my mom's too old to go to prison. She can't go to prison. We got to do something about this. So she asks her boyfriend, Ronnie Bryce, for help. So Bryce was an associate of Paul Hankish, and also got a cut of the brothel action there at Aggie Toomer's brothel. But they knew that if DeLerba decided to testify, she could, implicate all of them in crimes. So Bryce turns to Hankish, who's in prison at the time. They arrange for former boxer, mentioned it before, Ronnie Asher, to get together with Bryce about a job. Again, they call it, a house needed painted, their big secret code. So Asher is supposed to go to Canton to eliminate Carla DeLerba. So he makes one trip there. She's not home, can't find her. He eventually goes back to Wheeling. Job's not done yet. Bryce is getting very nervous. He wants it done. It needs done, and it needs done now. So Bryce says that he'll go with Asher the next time. So they meet up in Southern Ohio, drive up to Canton on May 28th, 1974, and with the intention of killing Carla DeLerba. So in our research, we went through the interviews that Asher did. He later in 1990, the interviews he did about that night, and he told different variations of the story, but all ended up with Carla dying. So we researched all of that. We read lots of police records. Shane and I even went to the apartment where Carla was killed. It still stands, still set up in much the same way. A side door that from the apartment upstairs, you can get in through there, a front door, living room connected to the kitchen with the bathroom off the side of that, and a bedroom off of the living room. So it was about 11 o'clock at night, May 28th, 1974. Asher and Bryce show up at Carla's door. Knock, knock. Carla knows Ronnie Bryce from the brothel, so no big deal. She lets him in. Bryce introduces Asher. You know, this is my friend Ronnie. You know, he's a former boxer. They sit around the living room, chatting 10, 15 minutes. Asher's being careful not to touch anything because he knows what he's going to do. Doesn't want to leave his fingerprints. While they're there, at one point, Bryce offers Asher a gun. Asher tells him no, he doesn't need it. So DeLerba, who was pretty much a chain smoker, she goes to the kitchen smoking. She goes in to make some coffee. Asher yells into her, "Hey, where's the bathroom?" And DeLerba comes out and takes him over to the bathroom. And she's got her back turned to Ronnie Asher at this point. And Asher hits her in the back of the neck with like a karate chop, is the way that the FBI guy Burgoyne explained it to us. Because aside from being a boxer, Asher kind of dabbled around in martial arts. So Carla crumples to the floor. Asher checks her. She's dead. Bryce says, you sure? You sure she's dead? Yep, dead. Well, Bryce, he wanted to be more sure, I guess, because he went into the kitchen, takes out this big knife, like 9-inch long blade, serrated knife. Then this depends on Asher. This depends on the story that Asher told. In one story, he says that he himself stabbed her 3 times. In another story, he says, no, it was Bryce who stabbed her 3 times. And then he also told a variation, maybe where he might have stabbed her once and Bryce stabbed her a couple times. At any rate, she was stabbed 3 times. She was dead. They leave Canton, Ohio, head back to Wheeling. Carla lays on the floor dead for about 3 hours or so until Pete DeLerba, Carla's husband, comes home. Can't get in the apartment. He doesn't have a key. He runs upstairs to Elva Keith's apartment to let him in. So it's like early morning hours, May 29th. And then Shane's going to tell you what happened from there.
Right. So the reason Pete goes up to Elva's apartment is a lot of times when Carla's not around, she leaves her key with Elva. So Pete's banging on the door. Elva, wake up, wake up. And Elva wakes up. She's like, what do you want? She doesn't really like Pete. She thinks Pete's loud and he's abusive. And she doesn't like the way that Pete treats Carla. But Pete asks her, he's like, do you have the key? And Elva's like, no, Bobby's home. Because, of course, that's what she calls Carla. She's like, Bobby's home, just go down there and knock louder. Maybe she's asleep. Well, Pete goes downstairs and Elva tries to reach the apartment on the phone. And as the phone's ringing, Pete crashes through the door. He breaks open that side door. And as Tim kind of explained, when they're entering in through the side door, the kitchen is immediately off to their left. There's a bedroom straight ahead, and then off to the right is a living room. And so as Pete goes into the apartment, and he's followed shortly by Elva, they notice some things that are strange. The kitchen light is on, a bedroom light is on, the TV is on in the living room, but it's barely audible. They can't really hear it. And the apartment is unusually clean. And this is something that Elva notices. Right off the jump, the apartment has been cleaned. And she would know. She's the one who cleans the apartment. And Carla is a chain smoker. She keeps ashtrays all over the house, and they're always filled with butts and ashes. Well, all of the ashtrays in the house are clean. They're empty. And that's something that Elva mentions later to authorities. Now, as they enter the apartment, Pete goes to the right through the living room, and he goes to that front door. And the front door is open, but the screen door is shut, and it's latched. Elva goes to the bedrooms, checks those, nothing there. She turns off the TV, and then she notices that there's a pot of coffee there on the stove. So she goes into the kitchen. And from the kitchen, Elva can see into the bathroom, because that bathroom was in their blind spot. It comes right off of the kitchen to the left of the door that they entered. And neither her nor Pete would have really noticed the bathroom as they entered the apartment without turning around. So from her vantage point now in the kitchen, she can see a pair of legs sticking out of the bathroom, and the lights on. And so Elva goes over there, and she looks into the bathroom, and that's where she finds Carla. And Carla has the knife still stuck in her chest. Now, Elva tells Pete, "I found her." And at this point, Pete loses it. He goes nuts. He tries to grab the knife and pull it out of Carla's chest, and Elva says, "Don't do that. If she's not dead, doing that is going to kill her for sure." And Pete's screaming and yelling, and he's pounding on the furniture, and he's making such a loud noise that Robin, Elva's teenage daughter, comes down from upstairs to find out what exactly is going on down here. And she said that Pete was so upset and he's ranting so much that she couldn't tell if he was speaking Italian or English. It was unintelligible what he was saying. And Elva, she's a tough lady, and she's keeping her wits about her in this situation. And so she calls him a dumb son of a bitch, and tells him to sit down. And, she's the one in there. You're not, because Pete's going around saying, "Why did they do this? Why did they do this to me? Why did this have to happen to me?" And she's basically telling him, "Look, you're not the one who's dead. Get it together." And she shoves him down, and she says, "Sit down until I call the police." And in short order, the Canton police arrive, and Tim can tell you what they found.
Okay, so I could tell you that looking into all of this, we never, I guess, pinpointed exactly why Coroner Shaheen ruled it a suicide. The Canton police didn't investigate much at all that night, but they did in 1990, 16 years later, after Ronnie Asher testified about this. They did reopen the investigation. They did look into it, but they never determined why Shaheen had ruled this a suicide. Unfortunately, Shaheen died like a year before Carla. They exhumed Carla. We kind of think that Shaheen had to be either bribed or threatened, maybe by the local mob on behalf of Hankish. But we could tell you the night of the murder in 1974, when the police came, there were lots of strange things that happened at the scene. We found out that when the initial call came in from Elva Keith, we actually looked at the police dispatcher's log from that night. The log of the call characterized it as an attempted suicide. No one's ever claimed to know why it was categorized as an attempted suicide right off the bat with the first emergency call, but Elva Keith never presumed it to be a suicide. No one ever presumed it to be a suicide who made that call. So why it was categorized as an attempted suicide off the bat, we found very strange. The police photographer who came in to shoot the crime scene, he told his supervisor that he felt like the detectives on the scene were rushing him in and out of the apartment, didn't allow him to do his job properly. He only took a handful of photos. His supervisor told him to write up a report about the incident and his concerns. He did that in 1974. At that time, that report is gone. It vanished from the police department records. Several of the officers on the scene immediately thought it was a homicide. But the lead detective, Richard Cook, he was formulating a suicide theory right off the bat for whatever reason. Woman stabbed with a knife in her chest. It doesn't seem like your typical suicide, but apparently he was already coming up with explanations for why a rag may have been in her mouth to stifle the scream so nobody could hear her killing herself. So the morning after, we're talking a matter of hours when Shaheen is looking at the body at a funeral home. He's there with a Canton police detective, William Newkirk. At that point, it's about 12 hours after DeLerba was killed. Shaheen didn't do an autopsy. He didn't ask anybody to do an autopsy. He just kind of probes those 3 stab wounds. Decided she killed herself. The detective says, why do you think she killed herself? And Shaheen makes some sort of remark like, oh, those old country broads, they're tough. So Shane will tell you, elaborate a little more.
Right. So even within the police department, there are questions about, the validity of the ruling that Doc Shaheen has. But beyond that, the federal prosecutors, they want to know what happened to Carla as well. Remember, they had her under indictment. She's in talks with them about possibly becoming a cooperating witness in their case against other crime figures in the Wheeling area. So they try to figure out what happened. And they even go so far as to subpoena Elva Keith to testify before a grand jury. But it's around this time that Elva starts to get threatening phone calls. People start calling her at her apartment. She eventually moves to a mobile home 12 miles out of town in a small little village called Magnolia. The calls find her there. And they really get to Elva. And talking with her daughter, Robin, she's like, my mom was not, an easy person to get along with. She said she could be very intimidating at times. But when this happened, I've never seen my mom back down from anything, but she backed down from this. So whoever was behind this killing, they were determined that they were going to get away with it. And so Elva Keith, she really didn't cooperate much with the investigation back at that time. Although she did later tell the Canton Police Department, about some of these things when they reinvestigated the case. And one of the things that she didn't tell the police at that time, but that her daughter told us last year, was that she had found a book in Carla's apartment. After the police had searched it, she had removed this book, and it looked like a journal, maybe with some names and dates and times recorded in it. And she was so afraid about what she had. She didn't really know what it was, but she figured it was important that she put it in the incinerator and burned it because she was afraid of what having that evidence would mean for her and Robin. And Robin said, whatever it was, she believes it was worth Bobby's life, that information was why she was ultimately killed. But what does this all mean? Where does this bring us? Carla's death and the murder and the investigation into it and all of the organized crime background and Wheeling and Pittsburgh, it's an interesting story. And as Tim said, we tried to get to the bottom of why did Doc Shaheen rule her death a suicide when it was plain to basically everyone else involved that it was a murder. Was he incompetent? Was he bribed? Did the underworld get to him in some other way? Those are the questions we tried to answer, and we couldn't find any answers to those questions. And as Tim pointed out, Shaheen had died shortly before the trial and then the exhumation of Carla DeLerba's body. So we'll probably never know the answers as to why exactly he made the rulings that he did. But that case involving Carla's death raises some other questions, and it raises questions that we could answer. If Doc Shaheen had messed up this investigation, how many others did he get wrong? And were there other people in Canton, Ohio, who got away with murder? See, those were questions that we could answer, and as Tim talked about a little bit earlier, that's what we spent more than a year digging into. We reviewed more than 14,000 pages of coroner's reports from Shaheen's 18 years in office. And we didn't just review them by ourselves. We had a forensic pathologist who took a look at them, and we also had a retired detective who specialized in child death cases and murder investigations. So with their help, we were able to go through these reports, and we found at least 5 other cases that were clearly homicides, but that Shaheen had ruled accidental deaths or natural deaths. And I'll give you an idea of what some of these included. One was a man who was shot by his angry wife while he was in bed with another woman. One was a woman who died after someone set fire to her apartment. 2 involved patients at the Massillon State Hospital, which is a state psychiatric hospital. One of the patients died after struggling with orderlies. Another was killed by a fellow patient during a fight. And then the 5th case was a woman who was blasted intentionally with a shotgun. Now, Doc Shaheen looked at these cases and either ruled them a natural death or an accident. And when we showed them to the experts, they were dumbfounded. They said these were clearly homicides. And as we dug into some of these cases, we found that the prosecutors and the police at the time had started to investigate them as homicides and as potential murder cases even. But when the doctor's investigation was completed, when they had that coroner's report and he was saying it's an accident or it's a natural death, the charges went away. They didn't have a choice. They dropped the murder investigations. And so people were literally getting away with murder. But that wasn't the only thing that we found. We also found conflicts of interest where Shaheen would rule on the deaths of his relatives, close acquaintances, sometimes even his own patients. There was a fight in Canton where a boxer named Greatest Crawford was killed after being injured in the ring. And Shaheen ruled on his cause of death. But Shaheen was also the ring doctor for that fight. He was the guy who was supposed to ensure that each fighter was fit enough to enter the ring. And so you can see the conflict of interest there. But perhaps the most egregious conflict of interest involved the investigation of the death of a woman named Dale Ewing. Now, Dale Ewing was the wife of Dr. George Ewing, and Dr. George Ewing was a deputy coroner. He was one of Shaheen's underlings. And Dale Ewing died at home. She was in her 40s, and Shaheen ruled the cause of death an accidental overdose. Now, he did this with no autopsy. He did this with no toxicology. And it raised serious questions for her family, especially her 2 daughters. The physician who had pronounced Dale Ewing dead, he didn't sign the death certificate. It was Shaheen who did that, and it was a month after her death, and even a day after Ewing was buried. Even she was already in the ground, and the coroner's office was telling the newspaper, well, we haven't gotten a report on her death yet. We don't have any information on that, even though the Alliance Police Department was saying, no, we informed the coroner's office that we had a suspicious death. And so down to this day, her surviving daughter still thinks that her dad, Dr. George Ewing, did something, overdosed intentionally her mother, and led to her death. Now he's dead now, and there's no way to figure that out for sure. But she says, my sister and I, we were always told Mom died by suicide, and it was only in a conversation with the chief of police that they found out there was no note, and that it wasn't a suicide, that it was a so-called accidental overdose. There were also many child deaths from the time period that were suspicious, and they were suspicious to law enforcement at the time, but they were not properly investigated, including by the coroner's office, even by the standards of that era. Today, there are specialists who investigate these types of cases. Back then, they didn't exist, but there were cases where there was documented abuse against children who died in very strange accidents. And it was always, the doctor would just take the word of whoever he was talking to, even though there was, in many cases, a history of abuse. And so when you take all of these together, and including the cases that we really couldn't make heads or tails of, and neither could the experts, there wasn't enough information. They appeared to be guesses, or if they were correct, the doctor wasn't showing his work. It's kind of like doing a math problem, and you're supposed to show how you got to that answer. Well, he would just put his answer down. He didn't provide any documentation or evidence that would support his findings. And so when you look at that, and it's not just a handful of cases, but it was like this year after year after year after year for 18 years, it makes you wonder, if you wanted to get away with murder, wouldn't you choose a place like Canton, Ohio? A place where the standards are lax, where there's always rulings that don't seem to make sense, or, don't seem to be supported by the evidence, but nobody challenges the coroner, and his word stands. Makes you wonder, was there a reason why they wanted to kill Carla DeLerba in Canton and not in Wheeling? Now, some people asked us, they said, why are you looking into this? Why are you guys digging up these old cases? Can't you just let the past stay buried? Well, for one, our answer was, this is a chance to set the record straight. These coroner's reports that we reviewed, the vast majority of them are now available on a genealogy website called familysearch.org, and anybody can go and find them. Anybody can look up how their ancestor died in Stark County. Those people should know that what they find there may not be the actual story of how their ancestor died in Stark County. Their family member, it might not be a correct ruling in that case. So it's a chance to set the record straight. But also, Ohio has no statute of limitations when it comes to murder cases. And while most of the individuals involved in these old cases, the suspects have died, the witnesses have died, there are a few where people are still alive. And that's why the Stark County Prosecutor's Office has convened a team of investigators to go back and look at some of the cases that we wrote about, and then some of the cases that people started calling us about after the stories ran, and reopening them, looking at, are there suspects still alive? Are there ways to pursue these cases further in the future? And we hope to have the results from that review very soon, maybe this week or in the next few weeks to come. Unfortunately, when it comes to Carla's death, we don't have any additional answers, but you never know. Maybe sometime the phone will ring and someone will tell us why exactly Doc Shaheen said that she died by suicide and not murder.
Well, thank you, gentlemen. That was very interesting and well presented. We appreciate it. We did have a question. Maybe it's a colleague of yours, Charita Gaucher.
Yeah.
Yes, it is.
Are you making this into a book? Which I'm sure a lot of people are wondering.
I don't think there's any plans right now to make it into a book. What do you think, Tim?
I don't know. It would be a good book. She's right. It would be.
Yeah, it would sell well, I'm sure, because all of the true crime books we have here are doing very well. We've had a lot of the authors on regarding both Bill Lias and Paul Hankish. There's still a lot of interest. And in fact, I believe it was Bill Lias's first wife who was shot in the back several times, and it was initially ruled as suicide as well. So there seems to be some imitation there.
Funny how that happens.
Yeah. And I'm wondering if there are any other questions out there before we wrap it up today. If so, type them in the comments field.
Now, what's the name of the fish place that we had a fish sandwich at?
Yeah, Coleman's Fish. There you go.
That's it.
That stuff was good.
Yeah.
Here, there are some comments coming that I'll put up. Someone who thinks it'll be a great book. Here's my mom who thinks it's interesting.
Oh, okay. Thanks, Mom.
And more good comments. So I encourage you to take a look at the Facebook video afterwards to see some of those. But does anyone have a question before I let these gentlemen go? I mean, they were pretty thorough. You can find the video series on the Canton Repository's website. I have had the address up several times during the video if you need to go back and write it down. Take a look at it. I watched very, very well done. And if you're interested in Wheeling history, you will love that little series. So I don't see any more questions. Next week, Ron Coddington will be back. Faces of the Civil War Nurses. Fred Connors wants to talk to you guys. Fred is a local journalist who has covered a lot of crime stories. And Laura says thank you for working with.
Thanks definitely to Laura.
Yeah.
She helped us out tremendously with the access to those archives, including the photo archives, which when it came to the videos and showing what Wheeling was like in the past, that was invaluable.
Well, thank you guys. Well done, like I said, and good luck with future projects. And do consider a book. I think you'll like.
All right, thanks.
All right.
Thank you.
It's fun.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.